Hello, Father Moss, returning to your home. I'm going to continue talking about the Inquisition, and I need to give some kind of indication of where I get my material because otherwise it's plagiarism. This is from a book called Bearing False Witness by Rodney Stark. Rodney Stark is a professor of Christian history at Baylor University, and he's a Baptist. And he's written a whole book of false witnesses against the Catholic Church. He explains why that might be. And it's very important because, I can say, well, it wasn't correct, or somebody on another Catholic could. But when it comes from a Protestant, it carries more weight because it's a Protestant defending the Catholic Church. And he says he does such not so much for the church, but for history. He wants history to be correct and reliable. So he's correcting all these misconceptions. But he bases it on rigorous research. We talked about the Crusades, but there are lots of serious historians who have gone through all the paperwork. The knights were accused of going out just to enrich themselves, but there's all the paperwork they left behind, all the loans they had to take out, and all of the foreclosures they had to deal with in terms of being indebted because of the Crusades. All of the receipts they got for making armor and buying horses and transporting horses and all of that's recorded. So there's a living record. Well, the same way with the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition, there were other Inquisitions. There's the Roman Inquisition as well. But the Spanish Inquisition kept records of every case. They had court records. And those are kept in Spanish libraries all over Spain. And so the researchers can go to Henry Kamen. Henry Kamen, Kamen, is very famous, and he's not a Catholic either. Went through all those records and has shown that all of the propaganda against the Catholic Church was false. It was all written up to discredit the Church and Spain in particular, because Europe was that was the main. Spain was the superpower of the day and the wealthiest country of the day. And they couldn't defeat the Spanish soldiers. So what they did is the printing press had been invented, and they used the printing press to launch all kinds of social media against the Catholic South. And that's where they come. But the thing is, those things were false, but they are still with us to this very day. And so I know that even myself, I always thought the Spanish Inquisition was just the worst concept of all kinds of things about torture and imprisonment and executions and all. And the whole world thinks that it was that way. And it wasn't. It's totally false. Now, there was some torture, but remember, in Europe at the same time, for example, in England, anybody who was a Catholic was tortured and executed. Henry VIII, for example, actually executed more people than the Inquisition would ever thought of doing. And a couple of people that he executed were his own wives. He was a horrible person, and he made sure that they're not only executed, but they call hung, drawn, and quartered. And that is hung, but not long enough that they die, but then also had their intestines all pulled out. And that was a terribly painful way to die. And it also pretty disgraceful too. And and they insisted, and his daughter, Elizabeth I, she was even worse. She was totally, and the unfairness of it all. We've all heard of Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary was a Catholic, and Elizabeth was the Protestant. Elizabeth was very bloody, but she was known as Good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen. and Mary was a murderous Catholic, you know. So all the propaganda is slanted against the church. Uh, it, and it's part of the history books because you know how historians they take records and they use that to base their narrative about whatever they're writing about. So the myths get perpetuated. But nowadays, serious historians are telling a whole different story, and they're proving that most of this propaganda against Catholic Church is false. But the issue here in the Inquisition is heresy. Now, we look at it and say, well, so, because we live in such a politically driven world that we can let some of this go. But as a matter of fact, there's a long history of heresy that really disrupted social order. Ever since Rome fell, then the Christians were pushed to the periphery by the barbarians, whether the Germanic tribes or the Franks or the Celts or whatever, Anglo-Saxons. They were pushed to the periphery, and then they regrouped and then started missionizing and evangelizing these tribes. And within a very short period of time, they converted everybody, all these tribes, to Christianity. It was one of the great miracles of Christian history is how quickly and how zealous they were in converting these tribes. But at the same time, the church was getting its feet on the ground because there was no government left. It was the church was then kind of given a direction for societies throughout Europe. Then all the heresies would start. The first one was the Arians, and the Arians created all kinds of trouble in the kingdom. The emperor in Constantinople, his name is Constantine. He actually had to bring these people to court to try to settle the dispute that the Arians were stirring up in the kingdom. And they declared Arius, who was the leader of this band, was banned, but nonetheless, they kept on going. So these heresies take root, and then they last for hundreds of years, and they can topple kingdoms. They can topple kings from their thrones because of the numbers of people who would join them. And then these heresies then morph into others. For example, dualism is the belief that there's two worlds, the material world and the spiritual world. And the material world is evil, and anything material is evil. And that dualism in the Manichaeism, the one that St. Augustine was enamored with for many years, and then that died out, and then the Cathars, or what we call Albigensians, began to cause trouble and spread. And to this very day, you still have, it's the same heresy, but it takes different forms. And so heresies are like cancer almost. They get established and then they just don't go away. And most of the heresies that have been in history are still there, you know. And so there was a real concern to stamp them out. So it all starts with the Cathars. The Cathars were in southern France. They're sometimes called Albigensians because their headquarters was in Albi, France, A-L-B-I, Albi, France. And they believed in a dualism that everything material was evil and everything spiritual was good. And so they practiced things like sex was bad, having children was very bad, letting children live after they're born was very bad, and abortion was prevalent for them. And also, the best way to die is to get yourself into what they would consider a holy state, and then someone come in and smother you to death with a pillow. So they practice suicide. So that's a pretty awful heresy going around, and they grew in numbers, grew in numbers. And And so the king of France made a crusade against them, and there was a big slaughter. And the church didn't approve of that. You just don't go out and slaughter large numbers of people. And so the church sent Saint Dominic there to preach to the Albigensians. I don't know, you know who Dominic is. There are two great mendicant orders in those days, which is the 1200s. The Franciscans, we all know St. Francis, and St. Thomas Guzman, who's founded the order of preachers of the Dominicans. And their sole purpose was to preach to the heretics. That's what they were doing. Also, as you know, famously, Our Lady gave St. Dominic the rosary, which people were encouraged to pray for the end, actually for the end of these heretical groups and for the strength of the church. And so St. Dominic was there, and he did preach, and he was somewhat successful. But the church wanted another means to deal with heresy because it was so dangerous to society. And so they established the idea of an Inquisition. Inquisition means just what the word means, to inquire the people and to give justice to people who have been accused, because a lot of innocent people have been killed. And it was, in Spain, it was Ferdinand and Isabella. You remember old Ferdy and his wife, Lizzie? They brought the kingdom again of Castile and Aragon. When they married each other, they unified all of Spain, and they're the ones who commissioned Columbus to go to the New World, and they were also the ones who eventually defeated the Moors, which was another word for the Muslims in Spain were called Moors. And there were a lot of people who had converted over to Christianity. So those people were called Moriscos, from the word Moor, Moriscos. And they also, a lot of Jews also converted. And the acquisition is they were only secretly converted, but they maintained their religion. That's really not true. Most of the people who converted were sincere. But anyway, that's where some of the trouble came, the unrest was coming with so much of the problem with heretics. Probably the larger number of heretics were called the Luteranos, which means people who were Christians, Lutheran Christians, were a big problem in Spain as well, because they were agitating against this front as well. So they all came in and this Inquisition. But guess what? Because of St. Dominic, it was the Dominican order, the ones who heard the cases. And the truth of the matter is, there's a record of all this. They were actually quite kind to people. And their goal was to encourage them to find out whether their accusations were made against. I don't talk early in the morning, and my mouth is not ready to not limber yet. So, but anyway, they wanted to know whether these accusations were true or not, because and so they had inherited from the Roman law the use of torture, but they didn't really torture that much. They did it in a few cases, but very few. I consider that torture was rampant through the Netherlands and in England. And then, I mean, to me, it seems so hypocritical that all this propaganda against the Catholic Church, which is still a problem for the church, was started by people who were much worse than what they were accusing the church of. And so anyway, but the cases were heard, and one of the most famous, two of the really important ones, is in the Protestant countries, people were tried for sexual things, like homosexuality and stuff like that. But that was not, they didn't hear those. All those cases were dismissed by the Inquisition because it's an issue of heresy. And those kinds of issues about homosexuality and stuff were not heretical. The only time those cases got tried is if they started putting out that it's not a sin, teaching that it's not a sin. And that would be a heretical teaching. So they got tried, but that doesn't mean they were tortured and sent to prison either. What they tried to do is get the people to recant and to repent. And they were very successful in that regard. But one of the issues was witchcraft. People don't know this, and this is good for Halloween's coming up, because witches, there were a few people accused of witchcraft who were tried in the Catholic world, but very few, because if the Inquisition got a hold of it, they dismissed the cases. And so witch hunting and witch trials were rampant in the northern countries. And then, of course, transported over to the colonies as well. You've all heard of the Salem witch trial. But they were all Protestant in orientation. They were actually Presbyterian in orientation. And so the judge would say to a witch, well, you've been accused of witchcraft. Get on your broom and fly through the keyhole of that door. And they couldn't do it. They said, well, okay, you're not a witch. Go home and stop bothering people. That's how they handled witchcraft in the Inquisition. Now, that's far more kind than what the propaganda against the church is saying. But did you grow up? I mean, I grew up believing the Inquisition was a horrible thing. And, well, I mean, there were cases, and there were some executions of some recalcitrant folks that refused to change their ways. But for the most part, there were very few deaths and very little torture. The church's rules, and because they were monks, they had to follow this. You could only torture for 15 minutes. That was the maximum amount of time. And that was cumulatively, you were only allowed to torture. Well, you can make people hurt a whole lot in 15 minutes, I know. But none of this, it's not this ongoing, agonizing events that we have pictured in our mind, And also, you were not allowed to damage the body in any way. No burns, no bleeding, anything like that was allowed. No cutting on people. And so the church had strict rules in terms of torture, considering that the church grew out of Roman law and canon law is based on Roman law. That's pretty lenient, to tell you the truth, and far cry from what the propaganda was saying. So anyway, but in England, for example, and more so in Scotland, John Knox. You know who Don Knox is? He's in the Andrew Griffith's thing. Mary. John Knox was the one who brought Presbyterianism to Scotland, and it so happened that King James II used witchcraft as a means to convince all of the Protestant world in England that he was a man of God. But because he went after the witches in propaganda for himself, it was actually a political campaign to convince people that he was fighting the devil, because the perception was these witches were in league with the devil. And so now the truth of the matter is these were just simple women who were trying to provide public services. They were, for the most part, midwives who went to help women deliver their babies. And they did use a bit of magic, which is very common in those days. Things like sprinkling the mothers with holy water and stuff like that, which was not really all of that terrible. But they got accused of being witches. And then out of that, because they needed cases for the sake of the king's reputation. I know this from Lucy Woolsey's Investigates. If you ever watched that on TV, I highly recommend it, because she investigates all these things. And she is doing the same thing that Rodney Stark does. she investigates and she's busting all these myths about history. I don't know if you know this, folks out in Camerland, but a lot of history cannot be trusted. You know, it's a lot of it is not there. That's why Catholic schools, they use their own history books, because history books in general are loaded with anti-Catholic allegations. They're subtle, but they're there. And so, but anyway, these women, and then somehow there was something sexual about it too. So they tortured these women relentlessly and very often in a very sexual way. And of course, the women, what they wanted is an admission of guilt, you know. And of course, they did admit. See, torture is a terrible way to get to the truth, because anybody who's being tortured saying, I did it, I did it, I did it, because they want the pain to stop. So that's horrible. And those poor innocent women, actually many of them out there trying to help other women, you know, get accused of being a witch and then end up getting executed. And the way they executed them was to tie a cord around their neck and strangle them to death. And then they burned their bodies. And in some cases, they burned them before they strangled them. So that, I mean, that's very cruel. Now, were those people who did all of that cruel? They probably thought they were doing a great service for society. They probably thought, I don't know what they were thinking, but they probably thought they were delivering society from the influence of Satan, because they thought these women were possessed by Satan. And they weren't. And so that's just one example. And it was those same folks who migrated to the colonies who then began to accuse women of this. So it was a crime against women in a big way. And the truth of the matter is, I've seen documentaries on the Salem witchcraft trials, and a lot of that started with rumor and Inuit. It's like young girls gossiping, and the next thing it was partly based on hysteria, and these people were so hysterical they would say anything, and as such, people lost their lives. And so, I mean, in the age of superstition and in the age of the lack of justice, you know, horrible things were happening. But I'm here to tell you, the Catholic Church did not participate in those things. They actually released the women and made it clear to the public that these women were only women who were trying to do good, and they were not guilty of anything. And well, they couldn't know for sure. Probably not influenced by the devil in any way whatsoever. So another thing that the Inquisition accomplished then was keeping the peace. Now there are a lot of slanders against the church that the Moors, the Moriscos not. Of course, Moors themselves or Jews were did not have to go before the Inquisition, because it was to find out the sources of heresy, and these people were not heretics because they were not opposed to Christianity. They were a different religion, so they were not heretics. But anyway, to keep the peace, because these people were fighting with each other. The Moriscos were Moors who converted to Christianity, were then very much despised by other Muslims, and so there was a lot of unrest in society over that. And then the same with the Jews, but to a lesser extent. And so there was infighting between the Jews who converted and those who did not. And, the ones who converted were actually accused for gain. They just thought that you had a better deal if you were a Christian rather than a Jew. And so there was a lot of unrest. And the way Isabella and Ferdinand dealt with it is just expel them from the country. And that was really unjust. But that wasn't the church. That was the hierarchy. That was the nobility of the land who did that. And, uh, and unfortunately, and another thing that people don't know is where did the Jews go who were expelled from Spain? They went to Rome. They went for protection from the Pope. The Pope himself was protecting them. And so it's not such a black mark in the Catholic Church after all. But other groups that were an issue for Spain too were slavery, because the Moors kept a lot of slaves. As you know, a lot of slaves. As you know, it's not too far to Africa, and so a lot of those slaves were Africans, and but also Spanish kept slaves as well, especially in the Canary Islands. That was really a huge number of people who were pressed into slavery. But the church was against slavery. People don't know this because so many Christians, Spaniards, and others had slaves in the colonies, in the South America, and so forth, had so many slaves. But the Pope, every Pope put out documentation on the evils of slavery, and it's a serious sin to be a slave owner or a slave trafficker was committing mortal sins. And that was put out by every single Pope. So the church was opposed to slavery all along. The problem with it was nobody paid any attention. People went ahead and had their slaves anyway. And even in the common literature, it's only literature, but everybody remembers Gone with the Wind and the plantation Terra. Well, these people, Scarlet people, you know, Scarlet, frankly, Scarlet, I don't give a damn, Scarlet. They were Irish Catholics. That doesn't come across in the movie very much, but they had slaves. But that wasn't with cooperation with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church condemned it in the South, in the colonies, and in the world in general, but they did it anyway. And as a matter of fact, the Jesuits had the brunt of there's so many people who wanted slaves in South America, and then the Jesuits had to take a lot of heat for that. Jesuits, I don't know if you know where Paraguay is in South America, but that whole territory was basically a Jesuit colony made up of Indians who were protected by the Jesuits. And so slavery was not allowed there. But see, the Spanish and the Portuguese especially, they wanted slaves because they wanted free labor in the mines, in the fields, but especially in the mines, because, you know, they were gold crazy. They wanted that gold, and they wanted to work people to death in the mines for riches. And so they fought the Jesuits, and they worked the politics of it in such a way that the Jesuits got expelled. After they got all the trouble to defend these people, then they're the ones that got repressed and suppressed, I would say. We saw the same thing in when Junipero Serra, who was the one who established the 21 California missions. You know, when he was up for, Serra was up for sainthood, then there was a big protest in the United States, and people in California were attacking statues of him and disfiguring them and so forth, because they had this idea that colonization is evil in general. But the fact was that the Franciscans, especially Serra, were defending the Indians and giving them a great deal of opportunity in terms of education and training. They had wonderful choirs. Music was written especially for them, for their choirs and all. And Serra himself, even though he had been injured in travel, walked all the way to Mexico City to protest against the Presidio. Presidio is the fort where the soldiers were, to tell the government to pull their people back and stop mistreating the Indians. So Serra was a great defender of the Indians, and they loved him. And yet, now in this woke country that we live in, then the cool thing to do is disgrace him completely because he was a bad man, which is a bunch of malolo me. And so those things just rackle me, because Bishop Barron was involved in that, trying to dispute that. Archbishop Jose Gomez, who is one of our best archbishops, he protested vigorously about that, but nobody listens. People just yeah. So that's a little bit of what we're talking about. So I didn't go into all the different kinds of heresies and stuff like that because we just cover them all in one fell swoop, and also one swell swoop, and my mouth won't go around the words, so and I think it's time to quit. So y'all come back. You hear? Nice talking to you. Bye.